Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Bettina Swigger, and I'll be the moderator for today's session. I have the privilege of serving as the CEO of the Downtown Boulder Partnership. We're a nonprofit organization here in Boulder that oversees a 49-block business improvement district, and we advocate for people of all kinds to gather in person in public places. And for recording purposes, today is Wednesday, April 9th, 2025. The session number is 18095, and the title is Finding Our Place in the World. As you're getting seated, before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal from these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts. While the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge, consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. One other thing I'd also like to mention is that we want to be sure that you get a chance to ask your questions. So here's how we're going to handle the Q&A. We'll reserve the end of the discussion for that Q&A, and we're using a note card system to take questions from all of you. So at any time during the session, ask one of our producers, Peter over here, Tamara in the back, and they'll hand you a note card and a pencil. Please write legibly. That will help us at the end. And if you're a student, please write that you are a student on the card because students get to ask their questions first. When you finish, please raise your hand to bring it to the producer who will bring it up to me. So I urge everyone to be brief with your questions and keep them to the point. We're going to start off by doing a brief introduction of each of the panelists, but I encourage you to really go and explore their full bios on the CWA website because each of these individuals is incredibly impressive, and I can't do them all justice by sharing just a brief moment here. So I'm going to start off with Danielle SeeWalker here. Is a Hunk Papa Lakota citizen of the Standing Rock Sioux Nation in North Dakota. She is a mother, artist, writer, curator, activist, and businesswoman, and is currently based in Denver, Colorado. As a multidisciplinary fine artist and muralist, Danielle works across disciplines to explore the intersections of Native American stereotypes, microaggressions, and colonialist systems, both historically and in contemporary society. Drawing on Eau Courant color palettes, expressionistic art strategies, and her Lakota traditions, SeeWalker spins her work into a contemporary vision to challenge what Native American art should be or what people expect Native American art to look like. She can be found working on murals in public spaces, including a recent installation here in Boulder, as well as working on fine artwork in her studio. And she's also a writer. She recently published her first book called Still Here, A Past to Present Insight to Native American People and Culture. Over here on the far right, we have Wakanyi Hoffman, a public speaker, author, and Indigenous knowledge educator specializing in Ubuntu philosophy. She is currently the lead PhD researcher on sustainable African AI systems at Utrecht University's Inclusive AI Lab under the Center for Global Challenges, otherwise known as UGlobe. She's working on the intersection of Ubuntu ethics and sustainable practices within the design and adaptation of AI tools. She is specifically looking at intercultural inclusivity of creative ideas, new innovations, and best practices in AI systems emerging from the global majority to inform governments, industry, media, and educators on new trends that are leading global society toward intercultural social project in the new AI landscape. She's also authored several children's books, and she speaks on the topic of Ubuntu African philosophy as a conception of human flourishing. She founded the African Folktales Project, a digital database of African indigenous knowledge contained in folktales. She is the mother of 4 multicultural kids born in different parts of the world, and she and her family currently live in the Netherlands. And before we got started, we were talking about our mutual town's love of tulips. Shaniya Jarrett, right here, holds a bachelor's degree in astrophysics from the University of Colorado Buffalo. Go Buffs. And a master's degree in physics from Fisk University. She is currently pursuing her PhD in astronomy and astrophysics at the University of Maryland, where her research focuses on applying machine learning techniques to study gravitational waves. Prior to graduate school, Shaniya worked as a satellite test engineer at General Atomics, where she supported key test campaigns for the $65 million Gazelle spacecraft. Her research contributions span multiple fields, including mapping large-scale structure through binary black hole mergers as observed by LISA, testing digital micromirror devices for space instrumentation, investigating Mars and Earth's magnetic field interactions, and analyzing solar wind irregularities to detect coronal mass ejections. I don't know what that is, so you'll have to tell me later. She has received numerous accolades for her academic and research achievements, including the National Science Foundation Graduate Research Fellowship, the Margaret Cunningham Women's Center Leadership Award, the Chambliss Astronomy Achievement Student Award, and many others. Outside of her studies, Shaniya is deeply committed to STEM outreach. She founded the Astro Beats Project, an initiative that merges astrophysics and music to engage middle school students. And she's been an instructor for the Black Girls Becoming Summer Institute. And finally, Seth Shafer is a composer and researcher whose work hybridizes technology, new media, and art and science with a specific focus on real-time notation, interactive music, and algorithmic art. He develops interactive installations and improvisational performance environments. His work includes generative pseudo-hologram installations, interactive floor projection systems, and live data sonification exploiting privacy loopholes and feedback networks. Also something I'd like you to explain. Seth's compositions have been performed internationally and across the US. His sound installations have been shown at Kaneko in Omaha, the Perot Museum of Nature and Science in Dallas, Long Beach Museum of Art's Pacific Standard Time exhibit. That was a great show, by the way. And the Long Beach Sound Walk. Seth is assistant professor of music at Cal State San Marcos and holds degrees from the University of North Texas and California State University. As a performer, he's played his own music, and he founded and directed Tape Ensemble, which is an experimental technology-centric ensemble. He also played tuba in the Golden State Pops Orchestra and with the band Vampire Weekend.
Cool.
You guys are really cool. I feel really lucky to be in this place with you lovely humans, and also with you in the audience and those of you watching online. This is a really big and broad topic, and I really want to hear from all of these people first, but did want to just start to say that when I first found out I was moderating this session, I wondered what the heck this was supposed to be about. So I read the blurb, which really broadened the topic considerably. What we're trying to discuss today are creative ways to find purpose and belonging in a world of complexity, inequality, and difference. And I think we can all agree that at this particular moment, as we shoot into the second quarter of 2025, feeling that we have a place in our communities, whether locally, on a state level, nationally, in the world, or even on this planet, can be kind of a confusing feeling sometime. So we're going to have a really lovely discussion. We're going to meander around a lot. We're going to go from place to place. And we're going to start off with this broad question of how do each of you define place here in the 21st century on planet Earth? Who wants to go first? Seth, you're laughing the hardest.
No, I don't want to go first. Are you volunteering?
I'm volunteering you.
Goodness. It was my greatest fear to not, I really don't want to go first, but I guess I'll jump in. Why not? I think I might circumvent your question a little bit, if that's all right. I want to give you a sense of what I know as an artist and the maybe the historical backing for some of the things that I think about all the time. And to most directly answer your question, I think of this idea of place perhaps connected with like a human experience that is mostly, for me anyway, a sonic experience, and perhaps the disconnect that we feel in terms of purpose and in terms of community and belonging, maybe could be analogous to this idea of noise. And so this is a controversial idea that arose at the turn of the century, noise as music. And I think it's illustrative to kind of know a little bit of the backstory. So if you don't mind, I'll share it briefly. So in the late 19th century, there was a young boy named Luigi Russolo who was born into an agricultural town in Italy, typical of the era. And I like to imagine the sounds that Luigi heard in his daily experience: sounds of cows mooing, crickets, wind, a lot of silence. And I feel like in some ways this is analogous to the sense of purpose. Like in that day and age, like he didn't follow his dream job. He worked for his father, tending sheep, because that's what the family did. Perhaps he learned how to bake bread or use a loom to create clothes or feed the family. Purpose was just built into his existence. He was born into it. And the same can be true for community as well. Community, you're born into that community. You know the baker and the butcher and all of, the midwife perhaps, everything about their lives. Community is just where you are. Your sense of purpose and your sense of community were just inherited. In 1901, Luigi Russolo moved to Milan. And the city was rapidly industrializing, and you can imagine the sonic world that he moved into was, in a lot of ways, analogous to a new sense of perhaps individualism over community, perhaps mechanization over craft, sense of craft, and perhaps even a loss of purpose, purposelessness, or even a loss of belonging. And I want to read you a couple quotes that I have of Luigi Russolo's work that he wrote, a manifesto about the future in 1912. And he said, based on his listening to these new industrial sounds of cars, of factory whistles, of the kerchunk of the automated loom. And he says, out of this sonic world, noise was born, and it's where it triumphs and reigns supreme over the sensibility of men. The old ways are irrelevant now. Beethoven and Wagner have stirred our nerves and hearts for many years, but now we've had enough of them. And we delight much more in the combining in our thoughts the noises of trams, of automobile engines, of carriages and brawling crowds than in the bearing again of the eroica or the pastoral. Instead, we must break at all costs from this restrictive circle of consonant sounds and conquer the infinite variety of noise sounds. And I find that this perhaps is an analogy that we can work with in terms of place. Is our kind of sonic experience, is it a noise experience? Is it a disconnected, disjointed, glitch, error, cacophony? Or is there, can noise be redeemed, perhaps? And I even wanted to pitch to the table here that perhaps even now in our session together today, we can think of new analogies to describe the 21st century in our experience in sonic terms. So thank you.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
So not just noise necessarily, but also the physicality of being in a place, right? The smell of the sheep, the smell of the industrial city. Does anybody else have a sort of visceral physical reaction to that notion of experiencing place through our senses? Danielle?
Yes. Petu washde mitaku yapi Danielle SeeWalker amachiapi mahunk papa lakota na achati shakuini mahata Denver, Colorado awati. Sorry, it's cultural for me to always introduce myself, who I am, and where I come from in my culture. I'm Danielle SeeWalker. I'm Hunk Papa Lakota from the Standing Rock Sioux Nation of North Dakota. I currently live, work, and play in Denver, Colorado. Yes, I resonated a lot with what Seth had mentioned about having these visceral reactions to what place means. I very much agree. When I think of place, I immediately think of a meaningful place that binds me to somewhere, or I think about what has bound my ancestors or my family to a place, and that is the familiarity of the rolling prairies, the smells and the timeline of the blooming prairie flowers, or the songs of the songbirds that come up every year, the smell of sweetgrass that fills my nose. Those are all things that that resonate with me when I think of place and what is meaningful to me in terms of place. And I think it's more than just coordinates on a map or something like that is what a place might be defined as. It's definitely something that binds us as humans, that has meaning, I think, is how I define place. Beyond the 21st century, just in general, is how I would define it.
Thank you. So, yeah, what a tough question. Place. I feel like I've kind of transcended this idea of physical place to be, and I can back up a little bit and explain why. So for the last 20 years, I've lived in about 9 countries, and my kids, as you mentioned earlier, have been born in different parts of the world. And I used to have a very strong sense of physical place. I was born and raised in Kenya, and that is home, or that was home as a child growing up. And I can still smell Kenya. I can invoke that sense of smelling, hearing it, feeling it. A song would evoke a particular sensation in me. When you land in Nairobi, there's a particular smell of the earth, and that is very much unique to where I'm from. So there is that sense of place. But over time, I think for me, place has become more of a story. So I'm part of a story of a place, not necessarily belonging in a particular place. So I can conjure up an idea of having lived in a particular place. So I lived in Bangkok, for example, and I don't belong in Thailand, but there's a particular place there that I can bring back that memory, and that is tied to story. So less physical existence and more the connection to a particular experience, which is all obviously story, memory. And I have a little story about one of my kids. I have 4 kids, and my second born, who's 16 now, he was about 3 years old when we moved to Bangkok. And I remember we were standing outside our apartment building waiting for our stuff to come. We had moved from Ethiopia. He was a little boy. He didn't really have a sense of the entire move and what that would mean. So I kept telling him that, our stuff, our house is coming. I'm not sure why I used the term house is coming. I think it was a dad actually who kept saying, the house is coming, all our stuff is coming. So in his little mind, he thought that the entire Ethiopian home was actually going to come as it was in the container and arrive. And I remember standing there waiting for the shipping container to arrive. And he kept going like, so the house is coming. And I was ignoring him, trying to make sure that I don't miss the truck coming. And finally I turned to him and I said, what do you mean the house? And he said, well, the house is coming, like the entire house. And I said, no, your stuff is coming, right? So all of your stuff is coming. And so I started mentioning the things that we had, his toys or his bed and all this, and the green couch. And he was 3 years old and he looked up to me and he said, oh, so home is where the green couch is. And that has been my mantra for place. So place is, home is where we gather, where we come together. And it's a story. It remains a story as much as it can be a physical place. But for the most part, I think place is the story that makes you come alive. That is where you belong.
Home is where the So home is where the green couch is. I'm gonna remember that for a long time. We've talked so much about the physicality of place, of memory, of storytelling, and Shaniya, I'm gonna call on you for a little bit of a scientific perspective. Could you maybe explain what the physics behind some of this could potentially be?
The physics behind place, behind home?
Yeah.
That's a really interesting question. So since I have a science background, I spend probably a lot more time in my own imagination instead of being present with my senses. I'm always thinking about, how can we get off of planet Earth instead of what's happening, and how can I be in the moment on Earth? It's interesting to think about place as this physical thing. When I think about physics, you can get pretty philosophical with it, of asking, when does this table become a table? When does Shaniya become Shaniya? I am just a collection of all of these particles, and there's no definite boundary of where these things start and stop. And so home really isn't a physical space. It's not a particular location in space and time. And so I really appreciate that you were mentioning, it's not where this house is moving to, it's not what this house is going, but really it's the memories that you have there that are so important. And I think over the years I've really started to reflect on the things that I value the most, and I don't realize what those values are until something is missing. And so I think trying to find a sense of belonging and a sense of place on Earth, even though when my mind is in the clouds, it's really been having a community that has always brought me back. And it's the people that I care about the most, and it's the friendships that I have made as a young adult growing up. It's how meaningful these things are to me, that I realize how much I need them in my life.
Lovely. So I'm going to open it up a little bit, and some of you have brought your own practice and perspective into this answer already, but what practices, perspectives, collaborations have helped you reimagine belonging, not just as fitting in, but as contributing to something greater in the world? Seth's the number one guy.
I guess it's fitting. Yeah, I'll go next. I'll speak to you from my perspective as an educator, and just as a short aside, I rarely utter that last phrase I just said. I don't think of myself as an educator. I, in fact, desperately did not want to be an educator. And I guess it's like a black hole. It pulled me in, and it's lured me into the great and incredible satisfaction of working with students. And I've become, in a way, addicted to seeing students flourish and thrive and find their voice, and to speak to this idea of what is belonging. I'll just speak from my experience at a previous institution where I helped establish a sense of belonging. And I feel like that is, of the many things that were listed on the bio earlier, I think the thing that's not listed that I'm probably more proud of than anything else in that bio is the sense that we together, myself and those students, established a sense of belonging with each other. And as I reflect on how that happened or why that happened, I have a couple of takeaways that I keep with me. And perhaps chief among them was the fact that it was not my community. And it wasn't their community only, it was a shared community, a sense of like a shared ownership with something. As an example, prior to that blossoming, my experience as a student has often been from expert down to, the novices, those in training, right? And it's a sense of hierarchy of one who knows a lot versus one who desires to know a lot. And I think what was magical about what happened in this community of students who were studying music and technology was this sense that we all desired to admit that we didn't know everything. And I think that was such a freeing admission. And you could see year after year, incoming students come in, perhaps straight from high school. The classes that we taught were like making beats, making electronic music, producing, mixing, recording music. And there's often, a little bit of machismo and flair and showmanship that happens associated with that. And so you'd see these freshmen come into the group, and I have this album out, and this number of streams, and this these numbers of clients I've worked with, or look at my Instagram. And it was interesting to see how within about a couple weeks' time, they would realize that the rest of the people in that room, although they were probably much more accomplished, weren't out there like tooting their own horn, and instead we're kind of from this we're operating from this place of desiring to know more and to share their knowledge with each other. And it created this really beautiful sense of shared ownership in the group. And honestly, it was a very thriving environment for everybody. So that's from just my personal experience, one of the things I'm most aware of when I think of belonging and sense of community.
That just conjured up a conversation I had with a 3-year-old once, and no, I mean this in a very kind way. We were talking about sharing, and the 3-year-old looked up at me and said, "Sharing means you give it to me." Which, the 3-year-old was not actually incorrect in this particular circumstance, because I think we were talking about a piece of pie. But it's interesting that what you were just talking about is sort of creating an organic, level playing field where everybody is engaged in the process, and not maybe one person opening the door to another, or having a historically excluded group of people who are then being asked to sit at a table that they did not create. And that leads me to some of your work, Danielle. I was wondering if maybe you could talk about some of your projects and that perspective about having a shared platform for creating an inclusive place to belong.
So we're not ever given a list of these questions beforehand.
I just made that up.
So we have to be very impromptu, which I find is my favorite part of this event, is just the impromptu responses. But immediately when Bettina read the question, my immediate thought was, I struggled with belonging most of my life. I didn't feel a sense of belonging most of my life. Growing up in North Dakota, it was either you were white or you were Native American, and it was very, very black and white, so to speak. And as a Native person, or a mixed race person and biracial, I had a white mother and a Native American father, and very much my Native roots were very much instilled with me at home. But I went to a school where there was a lot of non-Native students, and I'd never felt like I belonged. I didn't feel white enough. I didn't feel Native enough in a lot of cases. And I didn't know how to, I struggled with that a lot, with belonging and self-identity crisis. I didn't know like what I wanted to do. I just remember wanting to chop off my 2 long braids. I wanted to stay out of the sun so my skin would not get dark. I wanted to change my last name from SeeWalker to Walker, and I wanted to fit in so I felt belonged somewhere. Because I didn't feel like I belonged as a Native American little girl. But I turned to art. Art was my medicine. That's how I felt, how I could express myself in ways that I didn't know how to express myself in other ways, with words or through anything else. So I've always had a pack of crayons with me. I always had a piece of paper. I was very creative. my entire life. And that was how I expressed myself, and how I found a sense of belonging in this world was sharing my experiences, my stories that were told to me, stories about my culture from a different perspective, not often told, and being able to redirect narratives to tell people about Native people and Indigenous people here and our experiences. And that was my way of belonging. And I didn't start publicly showing my artwork until 2020. So I sort of just pocketed my artwork. It was my diary, very personal. And when I started to show my work, it was such a vulnerable feeling. I was so scared to hear anybody's reaction. But thankfully, the reactions were pretty good, and people were intrigued and interested. And I got the question a lot, wow, do you consider your art Native American art? I was like, well, yeah, I'm a Native and I create art, so yeah, it is. But it was challenging this idea of what Native American art should look like and what it should be and the stories that should be told. And that was an eye-opening moment for me in realizing what the narratives were out there all this time of what people think who we are and who we should be. And that made me realize why I didn't feel like I belonged, because it was always this idea of what I should be. I should be this poor Indian girl that comes from drunk parents, and all the odds are stacked up against me, and I need to whitewash myself in order to have success. And that was always the narrative in my life. And I guess I'm rambling at this point, but I will say that belonging was something I always struggle with. I think I still struggle with it in some cases. I look at this panel, I look sometimes I have, imposter syndrome. I'm like, why am I up here? I don't belong. I'm sitting next to a rocket scientist and a composer, and I'm just there's just little old me trying to belong. So yeah, Forrest Gump, that's all I have to say about that.
I have actually a lot of sympathy for you, because I have a bit of a similar background. So I am also biracial, and my mother is white and my father is Jamaican. And so I was raised predominantly by my mother, and so most of my exposure to the world was from that side of my family. And so, similar experiences of, I have to pick one side or the other. There's already expectations of me to fulfill one role and one way that people would perceive me. And so I remember in middle school, I was full on goth, because I was just rebelling in every way that I could. But I always just felt so discouraged for my music tastes, and people would tell me, oh, that's white people music, and I'd say, I don't understand. My mother is white. That's a part of who I am, and music is this shared thing that we all get to enjoy. It shouldn't be limited to your background in the same way that your art shouldn't be limited to what you see or how you feel. And so I just really, really appreciate that you brought that up, because even as I ventured out into more of the science direction, it just felt like people didn't expect me to be in this space. And so I almost wanted to do it even more, just so I could show them that anybody can do this. And there's no reason to place certain expectations on people because of their background. So if you're on your way to becoming this wonderful artist, and you think, I'm up here on this panel with all these amazing people, I have the same feeling I just have so much admiration and respect for people who are artists. To be able to make yourself so vulnerable in that way is something I've just always envied.
I wonder if we could spin this out a little bit further, because what I've heard so far is that we're talking about sort of the physicality of place, the processing through the sensory, storytelling, memory, our family lineage, literally the bodies that we inhabit, the color of our skin, the ways that we are physical beings. And we're living in this moment where that is not the only way that people have identities. We don't just have identities. And so I'm hoping that we can talk a little bit now about the rise of artificial intelligence and immersive virtual spaces. How are our notions of place and identity and belonging evolving? And can these digital realms perhaps offer meaningful alternatives to some of the hardships that can come with just walking around inside a human meat suit?
I am not an AI enthusiast, but I do work in this space. Yeah, it's tricky, because on the one hand, we know that that's the future. And I think earlier on in another panel, we were talking about these generational differences that we have. You know, there's a certain generation that's growing up with artificial intelligence. They won't know any different world. In fact, their sense of connection will be very different to what we're saying, even their definition of place and all of that. And I think there's a place for that, right? They can create another meaningful way of existing, hopefully with the values that will promote their flourishing. So to some extent, I think that, you know, when it comes to artificial intelligence, I am less concerned about what that technology will do for us as humanity, and more interested in understanding how we create that sense of still feeling like we are human. Because this is a question now we're trying to wrap our heads around. What does it mean to be human? And that's why I got into this space in the first place, was going back to stories. So in Africa, we have this philosophy of Ubuntu, and Ubuntu directly translates to being human. So when you look at that philosophy of being human, that Ubuntu way, there is that communal way of being. You know, we say a person is a person through other persons, that your humanity is intricately bound up to the other person, right? So you can't be human on your own. So I am sitting with that question: how does that translate into another space that is not real, right? And we can argue about what is real and what's not real. How does our humanity, our means of retaining that sense of being, how do we bring that into a space that is invented, is created? And I expand that by looking at, from an indigenous perspective, the human is not the center of creation, right? So even our artificial intelligence is just part of our human experience. It's not the animal experience. It's not the mountains experience, right? So we've created this space for ourselves, and to me, it is almost like reducing us into an even smaller world, while at the same time has this potential to expand our perspective. So I guess what I'm sitting with is, can AI be a window, a mirror, like Ubuntu is? A person is a person through other person. Can we find ways to mirror those values that actually create a sense of belonging? That then, even with our artificial world or whatever it is, we're still able to connect on that truly human-to-human level and not find ourselves in more isolated little bubbles. I don't know if that's making any sense, but that's where I'm going with AI.
Can I? I find it really fascinating what you just said about trying to reflect humanity. I think, like you, I have a great degree of wariness when it comes to the employment of technology, especially when it comes to making decisions for us, especially creative decisions for me, and that's what I'm concerned about. But certainly there's even more scary implications when it comes to AI. But one thing that comes to mind is this idea of, I have a quote by this, I don't know if you're aware of this AI platform called Suno.ai. It's, if you haven't heard of it before, it's Suno.ai. It's probably the leader in music, AI-generated music. And just to give you a quick, if you have not done it before, you can type in a prompt just like you could in any other AI and say, write me a song in the style of the Beatles about bananas or whatever. And it will, what it gives you is an audio file at the end of a fully mixed song with lyrics that are sung. It's baffling. It's amazing. So I set that up to say this quote by the CEO of that company that he sort of made some waves earlier in this year, where he said, "I think the majority of people don't enjoy the majority of time they spend making music." Right. The majority of people don't enjoy the majority of time they spend making music, which to me is, it's actually, it wasn't shocking. I'll say that I can see it. I can see it. But I think what I wanted to make the connection with what you said is this idea that I think AI provides for us a frictionless experience to all sorts of ends. It removes the barriers to making music in this particular case. And I think there's some good in that. There's some, the person who would never imagine writing a song in their life suddenly has an idea, and they can, boom, realize it immediately. That's amazing. But at the same time, I think the removal of friction, conflict, work, the process involved in making art, or we could expand it, the process involved in becoming a friend to somebody, helping curate a community of people, the process of like the real struggle that we feel in like trying to fit in and belong, accept our identity and our purpose. I mean, that is like hard work. And I think, you know, what the CEO is maybe saying is like, we don't have to work for that anymore. We can just type in the prompt and get it. We can get what we want immediately. And I worry that it misses the point, which is that the work is the point. Like the process, the friction is the experience. The process of writing a piece of music is the music. You discover the music that you had to say in the struggle. And so I just worry about like the lack of that struggle.
I am the least techie person out there. Even though I am existing in this era of all this technology, I still am like paper and pencil is my best friend. And I think that with what you said about the process is kind of being eliminated, this frictionless process, that scares me. I think that it's almost, in my mind, I feel like, are our brains going to start melting because we're not like using it the way we should be? Are we... is things just going to be easy, like at this literally like the push of a button, and like things think for us? I think about like my kids and the interpersonal skills that they might be losing by just like being behind a screen all the time. And I worry about those things more so than I spend time thinking about all the benefits, I suppose, of what AI and like all that could bring. So I worry about that. And I love the idea of Ubuntu. We have a similar philosophy in my culture. It's called mitakuye oyasi, which means everything is related. We are all related. We're related to our water. We're related to our winged and four-legged relatives. Everything is a circle, and we're all related. And I think about, like, where does AI fit into that? I don't know that we're related to that. And I think about, like, also, man, it's such a cool time to be 41 years old, who knows a world when there was no internet and had to handwrite letters using paper and pencil and using cursive. And now I also am living in this world of having to try to use ChatGPT and raising children that use technology as like their main resource. And it's almost like, wow, we're going through another industrial revolution. And like what my ancestors did in that time, got to see the automobile come alive and like all these huge inventions that didn't exist, and they only knew, you know, plowing in the fields or picking wild turnips in the prairies before all these technologies. So I feel like we're kind of in this like another boom of evolution in terms of technology and that revolution. But yeah, AI and all that stuff scares me. I don't know. I don't know how it fits in.
I'm with you, Danielle. I feel like the frictionless project is that sort of, well, I spent a lot of time in the practice room, for one, and making music without having to do that sounds absolutely delicious on one side of things, but how can you actually call it music, actually? I'm not sure. But I want to get back to this idea of like, if we are having a frictionless way to make art or make creative, I don't know what products, let's say creative product, not art, it almost seems like we're accelerating the culture in this really frightening way. And I think about place and how humans have built up places and buildings and cities and cultures and civilizations. Like we have cathedrals and pyramids that took generations to build, right? You'd have a family and then their great-grandchild might know what the finished product looked like. And I want to come back to you, Shaniya, and wonder if there's anything where we can talk about like the acceleration of culture, the acceleration of the way place is built, and the acceleration of particles in the universe. As a total armchair physicist, I am asking this question.
When you say that, I think of accelerated particles as radiation, and it destroys our DNA, and that's not.
Nice. I like that.
I know, people are bringing up a lot of really good insights and kind of difficult things to think about, and I don't know if I have any immediate thoughts on your question, but I was kind of starting to think about if we're in a place where we don't have that friction. I think that's where you can develop empathy, in my opinion. If you are experiencing a challenge or a struggle or something that takes a lot of time to work through, then I don't think you will appreciate it as much. And so I've always thought about if we were far in the future and all of our needs were met, healthcare is fantastic. We live a long time. We have healthy lives. We don't even have to work. There's robots doing all the work for us. And what would we be doing? And then I look at people who are billionaires who have everything, and they are still fallible. They still make these very morally unjust decisions. And so I think about if things are ever made so easy for us, how does our moral alignment change? How does, when we wake up every day, what do we decide to do? What do we decide to care about? Yeah, this is a tough panel. I was on a panel this morning about humanity in space, and I thought it was challenging. And you guys are bringing up a lot of really interesting things to think about.
Can I offer one thing about acceleration, which is just a follow-up with my anecdote about Luigi Russolo, the Italian so-called futurist. He was part of the futurist movement in Italy in the 19 teens. And in a lot of ways, he kind of prefigures this idea of societal acceleration. Basically, in some, he's like saying, let's forget the past, let's burn it, and let's move headlong into the future, which part of me is like behind. I think let's do it, right? Let's go for it. But I think it's worth knowing the end of that story, which is that the futurist movement was wholeheartedly embraced by fascism. And so I think it's just a bit of a warning that although he's a harbinger for, I think, innovation, change, experimentalism, the pursuit of kind of like newness for the sake of newness, which I think, I love that, it's also a bit like you can go too far, right? You can go too far in that direction and find peril. And then I just wanted to share another quote in relation to this idea of the work involved. And this is from the composer, philosopher John Cage. Do you know John Cage and his work? You may have heard of John Cage putting on a concert in the 50s where a pianist walked out and calmly sat down in front of the piano, closed the fall board, put his hands in his lap, and waited. And the audience looked around, and they shuffled their feet, and they coughed, and then they began to murmur and complain. And at some point in the future, the pianist put the fall board back up, stood up, and bowed. And that was the piece, right? So an experimentalist, but also, a believer in kind of the holistic nature of what music can be, the broadest, biggest expansion of what sound and music could possibly be. And I find it really inspiring. And the quote that I'd like to read to you is from his journals. And in his journals, he talks about he's really kind of like looking to the future and asking himself, like what, oh my goodness, I'm not gonna find it.
Can you ask ChatGPT?
I know, right? Okay, I'm gonna just look it up here. I'll give you my off the dome version of it, which is that what we don't need is a computer that gives us easy answers, but instead creates more work for us. We need something that doesn't turn us on, but instead turns us into artists. It's close enough, but I just like that idea of a computer that doesn't make life easier, but instead makes it more difficult. So I don't know if anybody's pursuing that.
I mean, I would like it if a computer could do my dishes and do my laundry for me so that I could spend more time making music and writing poetry. But I'm an idealist, a begrudging idealist. All right, we're going to open it up for questions here in a few minutes. We've got a lot of heady topics here. Anybody want to share some sort of final thoughts before we open it up for questions?
You're looking at me.
I'm looking at you.
Well, I'll just say a few words, building on what you just said, sorry. So with AI, can we wonder, and is there space for curiosity to wander around the why? I think a lot about prompts, and that's one of the things that I also work on. For example, prompting Suno. That's lovely, right? You can create music at the, touch of a button. But I think, let's take ourselves a few steps behind that and the back end of that consciousness. Why do I want to make music? Why do I want to do anything with artificial intelligence? Why do I want to do anything with any kind of tool anyway? And with that, therein lies the human aspect. The what is it that I'm bringing into the world, right? Because we're all creators, we're all artists in many ways, right? So that creativity, I think, is something that we will be, in a way, I don't even want to use the word force, but we will have to reckon with that. The artist in you isn't just pressing a button and making music. It's the experience that you've had, right? Something maybe new that you're trying to bring out into the world, something you're trying to solve for the world that's coming through you. And I think that is the work of the next revolution, is going to be about really introspectively looking at ourselves. How did we get here? What are the values that brought us this far? We're talking about the polycrisis, right? And we can solve anything with AI. We can go to space, We can, doctors don't have to do so much anymore because they've got all these tools. But talk to any doctor right now, they're busier than they ever were, and they hardly have any time to meet with patients, in spite of having so many tools. So there is something there that we are missing, a part of an aspect of our being, our aliveness, our interconnectedness to everything. And I think this is a point at which we can all begin to look at ourselves as humanity and what is the space that we belong in? What is our place, actually, in this world?
Anyone else?
No.
Okay.
Yeah, not after that.
All right, this is a question from a student. Do you think because of AI, the new generation will have new uses and/or interpretations of art?
Yes,
Yeah.
I do.
Would you like to discuss that further?
Yeah.
No, I don't really want to expand on that.
Well, I don't know that I have a very good answer, but I would just say that I think what the example of Suno.ai changes fundamentally is it turns the process, as we've discussed, like the labor-intensive process of making something, whether it's an image, a photo, an illustration, a movie, a novel, a poem, music. It takes all of the hard work out of the way. And what it does instead, what it replaces it with, is this sense of commodification, right? So that Suno.ai, it's like a subscription-based model, like everything. And so you pay enough money, you can make more things. And you become, instead of an artist, consumer, instead of an artist, you become a consumer, someone who is part of an economy of exchanging monetary wealth for art, question mark, right? Or at least the sense of art, or the replacement, perhaps, in terms of function in your life for art. So yeah, I think that's maybe one fundamental shift, is turning that experience into for-profit simulation, right? It makes me think of the Philip K. Dick short story, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Which you don't need to know the story if you've not read it, but the most salient aspect of that is that in a future dystopian society, animals are nearly extinct, and for that reason they're held in extremely high regard. Like, they're extremely desirable, almost to the point of like worshiping these animals. And so almost nobody can have an animal. And instead, what you can do is you can pay, basically like a year's worth of your wage to buy an android or robotic version of an animal. And in your way, what you're doing, like the purpose of it is to express your humanity, your empathy, your care of something that is less intelligent than you and that is dependent on you. And in that way, you're kind of like practicing and almost performatively demonstrating your humanity. And I kind of think of these along these same lines of this trajectory that we're going, and God forbid that like there's a future where there are few to none, no artists out there really making work. Or to, I keep kind of trying to blow up what I'm saying to like community, right? The community becomes false in this way. The sense of purpose becomes replaced by a simulation of purpose. And that we've lost the source nearly, right? The source of all this has been replaced by a simulation of what was the real thing. So that's one thing.
This reminds me, I was at a conference last week and got to hear a woman named Nicole Sterling, who's the mayor pro tem of the town of Nederland, and she works on a program, an international consortium of women who work in AI, and we were talking about this same topic, and she was envisioning a future in which there will be a higher value for things that are made by a human. And so there might be some kind of a label on a piece of art or a song that then actually makes the price higher, because humans require more, economic sustenance to survive than a robot does at this point in time. So that's another insight into that too. Another question for the group. So the subtitle of this very broad panel was to find purpose. And we haven't spoken too much about purpose specifically, although I think your last answer actually did speak to that a bit. But can you speak about what is our purpose here on a personal level? Is it to be human? Is it to figure out what being human is? Is it to feel connected to others in place? Is it to feel connected to our surroundings? Is it to make art? Is it to ask these questions?
How did you find your own purpose?
Yeah, I can kind of take a crack at this one. So I think at some point being told to practice gratefulness only worked so much for me. And so I started to consider different types of philosophies as somewhat of a guide to figure out what direction I should go in and how I should live my life. And so the one that I have resonated with the most, it's called absurdism. And it is this philosophical concept by Albert Camus. And it says that the world is inherently chaotic and it is inherently meaningless. And so the absurdity comes from humans trying to find meaning in a world that doesn't have that. And I think the reason I appreciate this so much is because you're given 3 solutions to deal with this dilemma. And so the first one is like, well, if there's no meaning in this world, then you could end it all, which I don't agree with, and I don't think Camus did either. It's like you get an opportunity to play a game, even if the rules don't make sense, it's still worth playing that game. And so your second solution is, well, you can take a leap of faith, and you can believe in something potentially higher than you blindly without evidence or without logic. And as a scientist, I don't like this one either. And then there's a third one, which is the one that I try to incorporate that I appreciate the most, and it's that you can rebel. And it says, even though that life is inherently meaningless, you can choose what to do every morning when you wake up. You can choose how to live that life. Making that purpose is entirely up to you. And so I think if you take that route of absurdism and you are on your path of rebellion, it's still easy to fall into this trap of, I'm not motivated if nothing matters. And I think astrophysics, of all things, and astronomy and space has really kept me off of that ledge. And I say that because we live on this planet that had all of the perfect ingredients for life to survive. We have gone from being microbes to hominins, and we have developed agriculture and civilizations, and now we're creating this incredible and advanced tech. And I think despite your circumstances, it would be a travesty not to spend some portion of my brief life on this earth ensuring that humanity survives, ensuring that we are better than where we started. And so, space has a funny way of reminding you how small and insignificant you are. We certainly are not at the center of anything. And I kind of use that to, remind myself that I choose what is meaningful to me on days when the world feels heavy. And so I think if you're feeling aimless, that's one of the philosophies that could potentially help guide you.
I have a question for you, and I ask this anytime I'm around anybody that's in space, engineering, astronauts. I asked this question to Gene Kranz, who was the commander that led Apollo 13 back to Earth. And I said, are we alone? So I want to know what your answer is to that.
Yeah, I was on a panel earlier today, and we got to talk about that a little bit. And so I put things in the context of numbers. And so I said if we estimate that every star has at least one planet. Our solar system has 8. Some of them have none, but let's just assume that each star has one planet. And we have about, I think it's 400 million stars in our own galaxy, and there are 100 billion galaxies in the universe. And so when you do the math, it ends up that we have a septillion number of exoplanets, that is 10 to the 24. And so there has to be life on one of those other planets, statistically speaking. But then you run into the problem, which is called Fermi's paradox, and it's, well, if we have all these planets, where is this life? Why has it not reached us? Why have we not found it? And I think the most plausible case is that space is just so vast that even if anyone were to contact us, or if we send out a message, maybe the civilization wouldn't reach it in time. Maybe they've already lived their course. Maybe they don't speak human language. I really hope that we find something before my time is over, but we are a very small fraction in the existence of the universe to have all of humanity be around at the time that we are. So I think it's out there, but I don't have any proof. I can just give you numbers.
Thank you. Very cool.
Does anybody else want to talk about purpose?
A very short answer to that is I think that I've thought about this a lot, just having my own identity crisis and kind of trying to find my own way in life. It always came down to my passions, finding out what my passions were and making that my purpose. And raising 2 teenagers right now who are kind of at this crossroads between being a child and an adult, and them trying to figure out what life is. I also tell them the same thing, what are you passionate about? And I try to feed their passions and try to help them grow their passions so that they can eventually find a purpose to move forward on. And those passions might change all the time. But for me, that's what it comes down to, is what am I passionate about? And that's my purpose.
I think I'd just say briefly that during the pandemic, I had a bit of a crisis of purpose. And I reflected on the kinds of art that I was making, the kinds of musical choices I was making. And I think I realized during that time that I had been so safe. I felt like I had the world of possibilities and ability to say something, do something, and yet I didn't say much, I didn't do much. I think I was moved by that realization, and perhaps perhaps I feel a sense of purpose to say something and do something, and maybe to broaden that, maybe the purpose is to communicate just one person to another, that is, maybe that's enough.
I'll go. So from an Ubuntu perspective, as I said earlier, a person is a person through other persons. There's something within that statement that makes me think of what Albert Einstein once said, every action has an equal and opposite reaction. Reciprocity being the kind of the principle of natural systems, right? We're here because things reciprocate. One action, connects to another action or a reaction, and then that sets off another action. So if we're looking at purpose from that perspective, I think that our main purpose is to reciprocate, to ensure that reciprocity continues. And that could mean a number of things. That could mean repairing relationships, right? From an indigenous perspective, one could say making sure that whatever the ancestors had, whatever path they had opened up, that's the path you also try and open up for others, right? It could mean ensuring that your neighborhood is safe. That's purpose. So purpose changes depending on the need and where you can feel that need. So it's like compassion in action. That's what I think purpose is.
Yeah, I like that.
Lovely, just lovely. All right, so I'm going to combine two questions that I think are coming from the same person, judging from the handwriting. So apologies if this is actually two separate people. My grandkids are half white and half Chinese. How can I, as a white granddad, interact best and create a place for them to feel belonging? And what questions would you ask of your grandchildren concerning this topic?
That's a good one. So my kids are half white and half black, so I can understand that question. I think, this is where technology becomes something really interesting. So there's something that my kids like to do is to collect stories from the grandparents and then, or ask questions, for example, ask questions from my mom. And then they will, so my little 10-year-old has been using a lot of ChatGPT actually, or other AI systems. He will take the responses, so ask specific questions about the family lineage or whatever it is, even in the original language, and then put it through an AI storytelling platform, there's various ones, and see what story it generates. And this is an interesting thing, even for my mom, who will not use any of that technology, but just to say, at the same time she says, but I'm not a storyteller, I don't want to tell the stories. But that's, in a way, technology or that AI then plays a role in sort of being the story wisdom keeper. And I think that's something you can do with your child. AI tools can be great moderators of certain difficult conversations, right? Because there are so many difficult conversations when it comes to being in a multiracial family or interracial relationship or whatever it is, right? And the children, the product of that, the parents don't always know what the experience is that they're having on this planet, right, as they are. And I can imagine that for a grandparent, you have even less information. And so you will always make the mistake of saying the wrong thing or, thinking the wrong thing and being caught, on that. So use these tools to connect, to bring that connection. At the same time, that I can complain about how flattening ChatGPT is, for example, it's a really great moderator of tension, conversations that might go not the right way, and that's because the language of ChatGPT is very flat. So it does help in some ways to moderate and bring temperatures down when people are having a very heated debate, and so it is also a great tool to use to kind of, create moments of storytelling and inquiry between cultures.
I do want to appreciate that, there's a lot of concern around AI, but these large language models, they are really fantastic tools when, you know, I was younger when Google was hitting its stride, but it was always a resource that we used when we were trying to write papers in school. It was just always there for you. And so now you have GPT and Gemini that give you answers immediately. And though when they first came out, they might not have been the most accurate, that improves every year. And I always like to think that AI is the worst that it will ever be today, because it is going to be better tomorrow. It's going to be better next year. So I totally agree if you don't know what to do about that situation. It's completely valid to ask GPT for advice on that regard.
Yeah.
But in terms of identity, it made me think of a story. Sorry, is that me?
I don't know what that is.
I don't want to scare you. Okay. So it made me think of a story. Oh, gosh.
Do you want to use mine?
Yeah, it might be. Is that one? Good to go. It might be the aliens. You know. They're mad at me for outing them. But the identity aspect reminds me of a story. So when I was a teenager, I think I turned 13 or 14, and I needed to get a haircut. And if you have ever tried to cut very curly hair, it's very difficult. And so for most of my life, I've had one half of my hair just a little bit shorter than the other. But my grandma, she didn't know what to do because she's from the white side of my family. And so she just looked up ethnic hair care on Google. And so she took me to a shop. And she's sitting there talking to the hairstylist, and she's just asking, what should she put in her hair? Like, how does she style it? What does she do with it? And I just remember in my peripheral vision all these other black women that were just smiling at my grandma because she was taking the time to learn about something that she didn't know, she didn't understand. And if you're in this situation of having, a child or a grandchild from a different background, just taking the opportunity to learn about what it is that you don't know, I think is going to set you up for success in that regard.
That's great. Well, I think we have come to the end of our session, and our audio is also telling us that it does not want to cooperate anymore. So let's give a round of applause to our amazing panelists. Thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing you at future events, and please make sure to fill out your, goodness, that is disconcerting. Make sure you fill out your review, and if you have any additional questions, I'm sure that our panelists would be happy to take them directly from you. So thanks again.